And we're live.
Day 6, week 2.
Can't believe it's only been a week. I put this on a LinkedIn post this morning that it seemed like the longest week of my life doing these. There's a lot of preparation that goes into them. I'm glad that everyone seems to be enjoying them so far.
You were a younger man when this process started, Darren.
Exactly. I had less grey hairs. I'm pretty much grey all over now.
Guys, dialing in, we're just going to give people a few minutes, as always, to get set, and then we'll be kicking off promptly as ever.
What are you most excited for this week, Daz?
Data science. So I think it's the most requested one. So it's the one that I'm most. I don't know what I'm talking about. That's the one I'm most excited about.
And that'll take you back to your recruitment agency days.
Exactly. Take me to the old days, the black sheep days. What about yourself?
I think that the 3 days on DevOps will be interesting. I think it's a really, really meaty topic.
Yeah.
And I think one that it's a bit of a buzzword, right? It's chucked around a lot at the moment. I don't think, or it's quite a complex subject to break down. So I think it will be really interesting to spend 3 days going into it. I'm really excited about Yuta joining because Yuta obviously runs our DevOps community, and I think she'll be able to give some amazing insight tomorrow and Wednesday on that.
Great.
So just a reminder, guys, if you've just dialed in, we're going to give people another minute or so just to get settled, and so we start they're on the same page. Guys, just reflecting on the experience last week. Numbers keep chunking up. And we're going to be joined by an expert recruiter in DevOps tomorrow and on Wednesday, I believe, Mark?
I believe so.
And then looking forward to Thursday, we're wrapping off this week due to bank holiday with data science topic. So that'd be equally exciting.
For sure.
I guess the question is, Darren, did you do the catch-up over the weekend?
The catch-up? What of all the webinars?
Yeah.
Oh, it's everything I had on this weekend. Most people were watching Netflix. I was watching these videos over and over. I saw the front end one currently has 134 views on YouTube. I think 103 of them were probably me.
Just having it on
numbers up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Did you give a thumbs up though? Did you like the video? So you liked the video?
Yeah, I like the video. I'm currently a subscriber of our YouTube channel, so we're going viral. You got to, when you're looking at the numbers that PewDiePie does. He's the only YouTuber I know the name of, so we're coming for him. I think he's got something like 10 million subscribers. So give it 2 weeks, I think we'll be there.
Yeah, fantastic. I see you as a future TikTok star, I think, Darren.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Guys, if we're just dialed in, forgive the internal banter here. We're just going to give people, I think, maybe one more minute to get dialed in, and then we'll kick off and start going. As always, get your questions in the Q&A section and any salutations to your colleagues or any comments you want to give or feedback to the speakers, put them in the comment section.
Yeah, and just on that, I know on Friday there was a few questions in the chat. By default, Zoom will only send your chat messages to the panelists. So there's a drop down you can select in blue that will say all panelists by default. If you change that to all panelists and attendees, then it means everybody can see the chat. So that's the best way to use the chat. Obviously, you've got the Q&A function for any Q&As.
Cool. So I think we've got into our 3 figures level, guys. Are we good to start?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. So, guys, welcome back after the weekend. Today's session is going to be an introduction to DevOps. So tomorrow, Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll be having deep dives into this, and I think we'll show you the agenda for the rest of the week, showing that we'll do a session on data science on Thursday, and Friday's obviously the bank holiday this week. I'm Dale, I'm the host. We are joined today by Mark and Darren, who some of you guys will have got to know over the course of last week. And as ever, Daisy is making sure we keep on track with things as our erstwhile moderator. And so today's about DevOps, but before we dive into that, just to recap some housekeeping. So just a reminder from last week, we now have a Slack group. We're sending those invitations and requests out where throttled, so we're going to send out a certain number a day, but certainly by the end of the week, I think we should have expected to get those all out. Any questions of that, always hello@hackerjob for any queries. As Mark mentioned a second ago, if you're putting comments, please use the all participants. That gets everyone involved and it means everyone can see your comments and questions there. Just a reminder, you'll get these invitations to each day's Zoom webinar by email. Any issues with that, please email us at hello@hackerjob. And a reminder to, if you've been enjoying the sessions, have got friends and colleagues you think would like this as well, feel free to share the YouTube series so you can do a catch up on that. So you've got friends who you might want to persuade away from ITV Player, persuade them Real Housewives of Cheshire or Gordon, Gino and Fred is not the thing to be watching this week. It's the HackerJob Tech Recruitment Training. And give us a shout out on Twitter with the handle @HackerJob_co or on LinkedIn using the hashtags either #TRT or #Tech Recruitment Training. Reminder, we've got quiz, and so I think the quiz link is going to be going into the chat now or in a few moments. And just a reminder, anyone who attends 6 or more out of the sessions this week and last week will be invited to the HackerJob Wine Club. So free couple of bottle of wines can be posted to you, and you'll be invited to join a web Zoom session with our professional sommelier wine expert. Okay, so just to recap on the agenda. So today is an introduction to DevOps, and then so the 2 sessions that we've got on Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll be doing deep dives into some of those sessions. So we'll be touching very briefly about cloud computing and DevOps today, but the deep dives will be later on in the week. And you can also vote for future topics that you want to cover by going to the link. I think that will go into the chat again a little bit later as well. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Mark, who's going to walk us through the agenda today and give us a really interesting session about DevOps. Mark.
Awesome, thanks Dale. So today we're covering 3 core areas. Firstly, what is DevOps? And we really want to try and deconstruct this as much as possible. I think DevOps is a widely used term. And it can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. So I think the real purpose of today's session is to deconstruct it as much as possible and make it really crystal clear on what it is. So if anything isn't clear, please jump in the Q&A. I'm expecting some tough challenges, tough questions today. So please feel free to jump in and ask us anything that you like. And then Darren's going to be taking us through hiring DevOps engineers. So the backgrounds of DevOps engineers and the types of roles on the market, and a very high level intro to some key concepts that, as Dale mentioned, we'll be covering on Tuesday and Wednesday.
Fantastic. So the first question, what is DevOps? If you could explain DevOps, Mark, that'd be great.
So like I said, very, very broad. So I think before we jump into what is DevOps, I think really important we understand what was the process before DevOps came into fruition, because this gives a lot of context. So previously, before the DevOps world, this is what a process would look like for software development. So initially, the software development team would write the code for the application. So as we covered last week, that might be back-end or front-end code. The QA team then tests the code for any bugs. And then finally, the operations team would release and deploy the application. So it becomes a public application. What why this was quite a challenging process was it was very siloed. So effectively, you could see each arrow is kind of the software development team just chuck it over the fence to the QA team, and then the QA team chuck it over the fence to the operations team. And there isn't much alignment. There's a lot of blame game going on. There's not much accountability. A really nice analogy for those that work in more operational roles would be the relationship between sales and marketing. So sales and marketing, you often see one team will blame the other, whether it be we don't get enough leads, or they're not good enough leads, or the sales team can't convert those leads. Quite similar in the traditional process in software development. When the devs would send the code to the QAs, they would say it works fine on my machine, it's your testing environment. And again, when the QAs would send the project to the operations team to deploy it, they would say it works fine in our testing environment, there's no reason why it shouldn't work in a production environment. So this was the traditional process. This is what DevOps, or what the deploy process used to look like before the world of DevOps. So if we move into actually what is DevOps, and this is a definition that we've written ourselves, because I think it's really important that we don't just copy and paste what's online, because normally in a DevOps definition, there is 20 different buzzwords, and it's really hard to unpick what it actually means. But what we believe DevOps to be is a combination of both culture, so the cultural practices within a team, and the software tools that team uses to combine the software development process and the IT operations process together to drive more automation across that process, across the software development lifecycle. So unpicking that, and we'll do this in more depth in a couple of more slides' time, but DevOps isn't a role. It isn't a technology. It isn't something that just exists by itself. It's a combination of a lot of different things, mainly being culture and software tools. And it's all focused on improving the process from writing code to getting it live to the customers. So that is what DevOps is at a very high level. We're now going to unpick each part of that definition, so you guys have got a really deep understanding.
Cool, thanks, Mark. So great starting sort of definition there. I think we're seeing a lot of parallels here with the DevOps cultural shift. As one we've seen, we talked at the beginning of these sessions about waterfall, project management to Scrum, that sort of thing. So a lot of parallels here, I think we're starting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we go through this today, you'll see how DevOps really is an evolution of Agile, which obviously was, a challenge to the waterfall model. But yeah, absolutely, Dale.
Cool. So moving things along, maybe tell us a bit about the origins of DevOps then.
Yeah, sure. So those will know that I like my history. So before the Agile Manifesto, which I think is probably important that we go back to there, as Dale was just alluding to, quite often businesses would use a waterfall development methodology. So in a waterfall development methodology, you would have the project scope, and then the project requirements, and then the devs, and then the QAs, and then the operations, and it would go down step by step like a waterfall. And it's a very slow and cumbersome process. And you see even some really big organizations still kind of operate this way. So Salesforce only update their product twice a year, for instance. We then had the Agile Manifesto, which was a more iterative way of working. And DevOps is an evolution of that Agile culture. So it's certainly not trying to replace Agile, but it's just an evolution on top of a more iterative and cross-functional process. And I think, Dale, you'd probably agree that cross-functional process is really key in both Agile and DevOps. We want teams working much more closely together. And to give you a bit of context, Agile kind of already introduced the concept of continuous integration, which a lot of people will now foresee as a DevOps tool, but actually it was part of the Agile Manifesto, part of the Agile methodology to operate in a continuous integration environment. And we'll define exactly what that is in a second. So that was already there. And then this fella, Patrick Dubois, I believe a Belgian software consultant, coined the term DevOps in 2009. And this is after he had spent a couple of years working on really big government projects and just seeing how siloed all of the different teams were. It was his DevOps term was inspired by Flickr. not sure if everyone will remember Flickr. I don't know if they're still going. It was like an image sharing website, I guess like the web 2.0 version of Instagram in many respects, less social networking, but more sharing photos. But Flickr did a presentation in 2009 where they were able to make 10 plus deploys a day to their application. And that is through a process of combining software development and operations. So Flickr, one of the first businesses to kind of take the concept and put it into a real life environment. And then it took a couple more years, as it always does, the whole crossing the chasm model, if those are familiar with Innovator's Dilemma, for it to come a little bit more mainstream. And there's a couple of logos there. You can see like Lego, Nordstrom and Target in the US. That were some of the first enterprises to embrace a DevOps culture. And now it's widely considered. If you're a tech company, you will be adopting some form of DevOps culture and DevOps environment. And even a lot of the large enterprises we work with from pretty much every sector will now be working in a DevOps culture and a DevOps environment, or certainly wanting to get to that position.
Cool. And so maybe for the lay amongst us, what are the benefits of DevOps on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And then Daz, maybe we'll take a few questions after this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Been a few, but so I think the first one is potentially the most important one. So what used to happen was to upgrade your application, your software tool. You may only do this once a month, or in Salesforce's case, only twice a year. What DevOps does is allow you to deploy far more frequently. So you will see a lot of organizations kind of boasting about how many times they update their application a day. So Flickr was saying that they make 10 updates a day to that application. Someone like a Facebook is probably making hundreds or thousands of deploys a day to their application. And that's because of the automation that they've introduced from their writing code through to deploying code process. Naturally, by deploying more quickly, you can move to market much quicker. So things process and the ability to release products significantly increases. There's also a much lower failure rate of those releases because of all of the automation that you've put into the process. And again, coupled with some of the newer concepts we discussed last week, like microservices, you can isolate and update specific parts of the application. And finally, the scale. You can manage much more complex systems than what we were doing previously with a lot lower risk. And those of you that were in Friday's session on modern software engineering, if you weren't, you can get it on the YouTube channel, will see that a lot of what we discussed on Friday around scalability, security, speed, those non-functional requirements we touched on are really what DevOps are trying to bring to the table as well. So all of those concepts we discussed on Friday really go hand in hand with the DevOps culture. So very often you'll see businesses that are working on a microservices architecture also deploying a DevOps culture and a DevOps team to support them. And the DevOps team are crucial in making those services talk to each other. So they're the core benefits. And I think as everything we discussed on Friday, as more and more people use web products and web applications, the scale that is needed is so much more.
Fantastic, thanks, Mark. So I think as you mentioned, maybe we'll go to some of the Q&A, some of the questions, Darren.
Cool. So hopefully there was a question around, I'll tell you the question, but hopefully what we just went through answered it. If not, feel free to chuck it back in the Q&A. But being in recruitment for a long time now, I really don't understand why DevOps is needed, but hopefully what we went through in that slide has answered it. And also going back a previous slide, what is an agile culture or agile environment? I see this often, but I'm not sure what it actually means. Again, you covered it, but if there's anything else you want to add, Mark?
Yeah, cool. So yeah, and I guess just to first go to that first question, like why is DevOps needed? So it's hopefully seeing it in the light of benefits might make that more obvious. So the ability to upgrade your application much more frequently and much quicker allows you to get customer feedback quicker, iterate on that feedback quicker, and effectively build a better product that suits your users more. So that then drives more user adoption, which likely will drive more revenue for your organization. So really key business critical approach is why DevOps is needed, because it just allows that iteration cycle to be so much quicker. On the second point around Agile, and Dale, feel free to jump in here, because I know this is something that you're probably very keen to discuss, but I think Agile is now bandied about as a corporate buzzword. So a lot of businesses talk about being Agile, and they probably mean the literal definition of Agile, which is, nimble, move quick, et cetera, which, does make sense. Agile was initially a way of working created by the Agile Manifesto, which, Dale, you're going to have to correct me on years here, but I'm saying early noughties, the Agile Manifesto probably came out. And the Agile Manifesto basically was a challenge to the waterfall way of working. So again, taking a very community-driven approach, a very sort of open source approach, there was a series of people that wanted to challenge the waterfall methodologies. And I think the core challenges there was one around speed and two around the siloed nature of waterfall teams. So how each function kind of worked in their own environment, own silos, had no idea of what the bigger picture was, and also just took a lot of time. And the Agile Manifesto set out a bunch of principles to basically work in a much more cross-functional, collaborative environment, with the main purpose to drive the feedback loop to be quicker. So rather than, spending 2 years scoping an application, building an application, testing an application, and deploying an application to find out that nobody wants what you've spent 2 years building, the Agile workflow and Agile mindset is about doing that process in a much shorter period of time. And you've now got a lot of different Agile methodologies, and Dale, you're probably more well-versed on me than these, but you've got extreme programming, or XP, you might see as an Agile methodology. You've got SAFe, you've got Lean, you've got Scrum, and I'm sure loads of others, and they all kind of stem from the Agile Manifesto.
Yeah, no, great summary, Mark. So I guess from maybe with a product head on rather than a pure engineering perspective, what you're trying to do is be able to make changes to your application, your website, your mobile app, and then be able to monitor the impact of that. So is that affecting the conversion rates or other KPIs, so key performance indicators of that application? Or can I get that maybe a version out where I gather more qualitative feedback? So from a UX research perspective, we release that version of the app to maybe a few tens or hundreds of users, and then start surveying those users, either with an online survey or face-to-face interviews, or probably today, web chat interviews, try and get the insight about whether that change of that site is better. One interesting thing just here is that often the phenomena you see about these releases, you have this hockey stick phenomena, and so what that indicates is that your metric goes down before it goes up. Often new things people respond to badly because they're not familiar with them, but over time that you see that change delivers a lot of value to a product or a business. So I should probably move us along a little bit, unless there's any more questions, Darren.
I think a few of them will cover off in the next slide about what's the difference between different job titles. There's a really interesting question around why are DevOps candidates so expensive? And I'd like to pick up on that when we get to the end of the session. That's definitely one that I'm quite interested in discussing, but I think we can move along from that.
Yeah, I think we're even going to quantify exactly how expensive in a few slides' time. So if we move on, so Mark, tell us about the cultural tools debate.
Yeah, so I think this is probably one of the biggest debates within DevOps. The rough argument goes on one side of the fence, DevOps isn't a role. DevOps is a culture. It's a way of working. So similarly, that Agile isn't a role, generally speaking. I know you do get Agile coaches, but generally speaking, you don't need somebody in the team to make you Agile. The people on the culture side of the debate will say that DevOps is all about that increased collaboration, less silos, more automation, all to drive better quality, speeds, and a quicker, process. And then on the other side, you'll say, well, actually, DevOps is a role, hence DevOps engineers, and that culture stuff's nice, but actually, it's all about the tools and the technology, which Daz is going to give an overview of today, and we're going to go into a lot more depth tomorrow and Wednesday on. But you've got stuff like cloud platforms and configuration management and CI/CD, etc. And this is why you might see some organizations call their DevOps engineers WebOps engineers. I think it's something we've seen as a few organizations do. And that's because they say that DevOps is a culture, not a role. And we don't want to conflate the two. I mean, the reality is the most sensible approach is it's a combination of both. You can't have DevOps without the culture. So there's no point, deploying to the cloud, building out CI/CD pipelines if you don't have that DevOps culture of collaboration and cross-functional teams. But also there's no point having the culture if you don't have the technology to enable that culture to thrive. So as always, probably sitting on the fence and taking a little bit of both from both camps is probably the right approach. But really, really interesting debate, and something that you could probably spend an hour on discussing with your DevOps preachers about which side of the fence they sit on.
Cool. Maybe it's the gin martini debate. Is it a gin or is it a martini? So maybe talk us through what this maturity model is trying to explain for us as well, Mark. Yeah,
so I think something that's really important is DevOps isn't something that you just do, right? It's not like today we don't do DevOps and tomorrow we now do it. Oh, great, we do DevOps to the best of our ability and, it's done, it's completed. I can put a checkbox in to say I'm DevOps or, we embrace DevOps. It's a process, it's a journey. And certain businesses will just be at different stages of that journey. And some of them may never get to the full DevOps mature model because it doesn't make sense for their organization. So if you look at this as a bit of a continuum, you start with the waterfall development methodology, which, as we've already described, is very slow, very siloed, might take you a year or 2 years to release a product. You then move into what's known as continuous integration. And as I said, this isn't a DevOps term. This was founded by the Agile manifesto and extreme programming principles. And this is basically saying when a developer writes their code, it automatically gets integrated into the wider code base. So there's an early level of automation in the deployment process. So rather than that manually happening, which is what would have happened when you saw that first diagram with QAs and then with the operations team, there's an element of automation that takes the developer's code and combines it into the main branch on a source repository, which Daz is going to jump into. And this is why continuous integration has been around a while. So why you will see some of the CI tools are more common. So the likes of Jenkins, for instance, you will see a lot of devs would have worked with, because you don't necessarily have to be working in a DevOps environment. You could have been using Jenkins probably, I don't know exactly how old it is, Daz, but probably 5-10 years ago on that continuous integration side. Then, so that's kind of the first step for businesses is can we automate that first part of the process? The second part is continuous delivery. And what this basically does is then automate the testing process. So we automate the code being merged into the main code base. We then automate the testing of that code to make sure there is no bugs or anything that's going to break the system. But there still is a human needed to actually get it into production. And I think this is where most businesses will be at from a DevOps perspective, is this continuous delivery model where they are automating the merge of code, they are automating the testing, and they're probably using containerization to be able to do that. But the deployment process, which is kind of the risky part, because you get deployment wrong, it might crash your whole application. Though if you're using microservices, obviously one of the benefit is it might only impact that smaller service, is still led by a human. But the DevOps nirvana, which we're going to go to in a second, the ultimate goal in DevOps is to get to continuous deployment. And this is where, and we'll go through it in more detail in a sec, but basically everything is automated from the moment somebody submits a code into the main repository or into the main branch, right the way through to that code is live in production and being accessible to users. So that is what we talk about, the DevOps nirvana. That's where we want to get to, is that continuous deployment world. And it's certainly becoming more common, but it's still not widespread. Like to have that end-to-end automation is really, really challenging. So Daz, if we jump onto the next slide, and probably the final slide about the intro to DevOps before we can take any more questions on it. This is what the ultimate DevOps nirvana looks like. And I think this will help break down some of the tools that Darren is going to talk through in the next part. So if we start at the first bit, we've got the fact that the developer commits new code to the source version control. Source version control, Daz would explain, but effectively what they are doing is committing code to the main code base. So if I'm a developer, maybe I've written some code in my local IDE on my local machine, on my laptop. I'm now submitting it into the main code base. And that might be using a platform like GitHub to store that code. Your next step is your continuous integration. So this is where you might use a tool like Jenkins. And that will notice that there's been a new commit. It will install all of the frameworks that are required, all of the languages that are required on the server, and it will build that software. And again, that was more of an agile principle. It's not necessarily new to DevOps. You've then got automated testing. So once the software has been built, there will be a series of automated test cases that will run in an isolated container. So away from your main code base. So this is where you might use a tool like Docker to execute those test cases and make sure there are no bugs. And this is where you'll use automation testing like Selenium or SpecFlow or one of the other million different automation testing tools. And then if it passes those tests, the orchestration software will start deploying it. And this is where it will deploy it to the cloud. So it will deploy it to servers hosted all around the world. So at HackerJob, we use AWS. AWS's biggest data center closest to us is in Ireland. So at that point, it will deploy automatically to AWS and it will start being visible to end users. You've then got monitoring tools to make sure that there's nothing crazy that's just happened. So we don't need to, roll back a release or anything like that because, it's gone into production and there's nothing crazy. It's all working as we'd expect. And you've got loads of different monitoring tools out there that we use. I think there we might use New Relic at HackerJob. I can't remember what monitoring tool we use, but we use something to monitor the site. And then, as a bit of a joke, the CI server will send a congratulatory message to the dev team on Slack to say congrats. It's live. And basically what DevOps does is all of this process happens automatically without a human. So the dev team can be going to make a cup of coffee, and in that time, this whole process would have happened and the release is now live, which is what enables businesses like Flickr back in 2009 or the likes of Facebook and Netflix to release tens, hundreds, maybe even sometimes thousands of times a day to their product. And quite often they're just releasing to small parts of their user base and testing, as Dale said. Do we see an improvement in this metric? If you're probably Facebook, do we see an improvement in the time you spend looking at ads or whatever it might be? And that's really what, the end goal or the DevOps Nirvana would look like, is getting this whole process automated. But the reality is not many organizations are there. It may be that the top 3 bits are automated, but that deployment process is still manual, or any combination of that. So hopefully that introduction to DevOps kind of breaks it down, less jargon, less buzzwords, into an understandable process of all of this. Happy to jump in and answer any questions, Daz, before we move on to some of the more highlights.
One just occurs to me that, so on this slide we mentioned containers, and you mentioned containerization before. Bit of a curveball. Can you maybe explain that concept for people?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a bit of a curveball, and I was expecting more of these questions today. We use Docker at HackerJob, so I can kind of give a bit of an example as well. But effectively, what you don't want to do is run your tests on the main code base, right? Because if anything goes wrong, you're affecting the whole entire code base. Whereas effectively what containerization does is spins up literally like a container, separate environment for you to run all of those tests isolated from your main code base. So if anything goes wrong, you're not going to break anything. So it's kind of replicating that whole code base in a container that is a safe place to execute your code. So at HackerJob, just to give an example of this practically, when we assess a candidate's code on the system, we spin up a Docker container to assess the code in that container, because if there's any sort of dangerous files or anything that might break, we don't want it to impact the main server. We don't want it to impact the main product. So it's a completely safe way of testing. And Docker is the company that popularized it. I think they got acquired for like 1.2 billion or something. And now you'll hear often about Kubernetes working in partnership with Docker to orchestrate those containers being built.
Great. Great explanation. Thanks, Mark. So Daz, we give us some of the choice questions out from the Q&A.
So I think given we're getting towards 25-2 and a lot of the questions are around the types of DevOps engineers or synonyms for it, I think maybe if we move on, that will answer a few of the questions anyway.
Nice.
Great. So thanks, Mark. So getting to the juicy bit, which I think a lot of our audience are going to be interesting. So actually, how do we go about hiring a DevOps? As it's International Star Wars Day, the 4th of May, or May the 4th, I don't think we could resist this little meme. So if you are lacking DevOps, Darren, maybe help us understand where we can find people with the right skills to.
Cool. So what I would say in this regard is, you'll see at the bottom, don't rely too much on a candidate's job title. So what we find is one of the pitfalls here at HagJob when clients are looking at job titles is that they aren't really taking into account the actual skill set and the responsibility someone has. So some of the best DevOps engineers that we've helped companies hire might even come from like a third line support job title, but actually what they're doing is very complex from a DevOps perspective. So just to break down kind of layman's terms, so software engineering, you're looking and you're responsible for the new development of code. You need to have a strong knowledge of programming languages and ideally some experience in cloud technologies. A modern software engineer, a lot of time we'll see that they've got cloud technology experience. And then a sysadmin is much more responsible for the management and upkeep of the infrastructure. They're responsible for scheduling deployment releases, and they're looking at scripting rather than programming. And then you're looking at tools like Perl and Bash.
Great. So that's kind of describing the two dev and ops parts of our DevOps conundrum. Okay, so talk us through the types of roles then that exist in DevOps.
Cool. So this is where things get very complicated because a lot of them are synonyms. So DevOps engineers, in the broadest sense, how they're seen out in the markets, DevOps engineers they're focused on the needs to improve deployment. So oftentimes they'll find an issue and then send it back to the developers to fix. Whereas an SRE is more focused on the how and why. So they'll be looking at processes and monitoring the process and then looking at the outcomes. Is it what we expected? And then if it's not what expected, they'll be themselves focusing on on solving the solution. So they oftentimes will be much stronger in the dev side of DevOps. DevSecOps. So this is the newest area of DevOps. So DevSecOps, as you can kind of work out, so it's looking at development, security, and ops. So kind of looking at a collaboration of the three. So what these guys are doing is they're creating security as code environments. So ensuring that security and tests are added into the DevOps flow rather than just dev and the ops. Cloud architects. So a cloud architect is involved in the architecture of the cloud infrastructure systems, which oftentimes will be looking after cloud engineers who, as their title suggests, they're more interested and more involved in cloud. So cloud engineers, other job titles you might see is like an AWS engineer or an Azure engineer. So these guys often come from a dev background and have specialized in a cloud platform. Linux and Windows, these guys are focusing more on managing the server and its usage. So their tasks are more around making sure that the memory and HD usage isn't being over-encumbered when you add new users. And then a systems administrator is focusing more on servers, network, and general IT infrastructure. That's a quick overview, but like I say, what the most important bit of advice I would give is, just because this is the general terms that people use, in the main, focus more on the tasks that someone's doing rather than what their job title says.
And just a quick question, Daz, from the audience, which I think is a brilliant question. Do you think that a person with no prior experience is fit for a real DevOps role? So do we see a lot of graduate DevOps engineers that I guess are learning both sides of the role on the job? Or do you see DevOps as more of something that you kind of evolve into from those two backgrounds you mentioned, either software engineering or systems administration?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in the main, we see that people will graduate from one to another. I don't know your opinion in the second, Mark, but we generally will see someone come from an ops background or a dev background, and a lot of the clients we work with ideally want someone from a dev background. But I know historically I gave this this example at some point last week, but I remember about 18 months ago, we placed a guy who was a project engineer at Jaguar Land Rover, and he didn't come from obviously a DevOps background. He was just doing a lot of stuff in his spare time and teaching himself the fundamentals of DevOps. So you can, it's shown that you can come from a background non-related to DevOps and move into it. I would say in the main, we see people come from an ops or a dev background.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's normally an evolution, right? I don't think we see too many people starting their career as a DevOps engineer. I'm sure that's going to become more and more prevalent, but yeah, I think it's something that people tend to evolve into. There's quite a few questions on the different types of tools. So I think that once you finish that section, we should probably jump into a few of these different questions.
Cool.
Right, so we'll move us along. So we understand the roles now a bit better, Darren. Maybe talk us through some of these key concepts.
Cool. So cloud platforms, or another term you might see on profiles, is virtual infrastructure. So what that's looking at, it's somewhere where your application is hosted. So these are still held physically. So a lot of the time people think that it's just up there in the cloud. It's nowhere, like it's not physically anywhere. Yes, it is. So there's server farms. So Mark gave an example of Amazon in Ireland, but you'll hear of a lot of these server farms being in places like Nevada, Arizona, places that are big desert areas, because then they can host these massive farms where all this information is stored. So here you're looking at tools like AWS, Azure, GCP. And then you've got infrastructure as code. So infrastructure as code is looking at, as deployments become more frequent and large, you're going to need more server space, but you don't want that server space to be there forever. So you want to be able to come in the morning, do a big deployment. For a certain amount of time, you want more server space and more containerization space. So you will put in some code. It will then bring up the servers. And then at the end of the day, you want to use some code to then get rid of the servers at the end of the day where you don't need it as much. So this infrastructure as code. A lot of time you're looking at how can we save money on our cloud space and our infrastructure space, because it's very expensive. Configuration management is looking at how you can automate scripts to produce software updates. So the worst thing you don't want to happen is to find out when you're just about to do a big deployment that all your updates aren't there and something fails. And historically, what would happen is you'd have to look through all of the servers and all the code in order to figure out what would happen. But what this will allow you to do is update stuff as it becomes available and stop these failures from happening. So here you're looking at technologies like Puppet, SaltStack, and CloudFormation, I believe, Mark?
No, CloudFormation, I think, infrastructure as code alongside Terraform. Probably Ansible is another big config management.
Ansible, cool. Thanks for jumping in there, Mark. And then continuous integration. Mark kind of went through it in quite a lot of detail, but it's looking at how can we push code to repositories as often as possible. So CI tools, you're looking at Jenkins, Bamboo, and TeamCity. And then I went for a continuous deployment, but as Mark said, continuous deployment is something that is nirvana. Not many companies have got to full continuous deployment. But as Mark said, you're looking at how can we deploy code and how can we test code without any human interaction.
And just sorry,
Mark. So I was just going to give it a couple of examples. You said there's not many companies that do it. So I know that Netflix, like you said, do it. Pinterest do it, and Twitter, they all work within CD environments, but there's very few out there.
And just got a few questions, Dad, so I think now's a good time to jump in. Is there a difference between Docker, Jenkins, and Kubernetes? So I think we'll come to Docker and Kubernetes in a second on your next slide, but Jenkins obviously sits in that continuous integration process. So that's actually about building the software that is being produced by developers. And then there's another question, Daz, around what's the difference between Ansible and Puppet compared to Kubernetes. So again, hopefully that explained that Ansible and Puppet is part of that configuration management build process. And again, I think as you'll see, because it's involved in a continuous integration part, probably more candidates have got that Jenkins, Chef, Puppet, Ansible experience than some of the topics you're about to come on to.
Yep, exactly.
Cool.
So, want to move us on?
So there's part 2 to our key concepts.
Cool. So containerization. So historically, you would have applications sat within one OS. So operation systems that we'll move on to in a minute. So what this would mean is that you can only have one application per server. So what containerization allows you to do, and through the virtualization of systems, what it allows you to do now is separate everything up. So it means that you can have multiple applications per OS, which means that the servers can run faster and you can do more deployments. So like Mark said, you're looking at stuff like Docker and Kubernetes here. From a pipeline orchestration perspective, what you're looking at here is tools that enable various automated tasks to be invoked at the same time. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but again, we're looking at Docker and Kubernetes. We're looking at orchestration.
Yeah, Kubernetes does. So one of the questions, what's the difference between Docker and Kubernetes? So Yuta will go into this in a lot more depth on Wednesday, because Yuta's actually done a whole presentation to one of our clients on the difference between Docker and Kubernetes, but Docker more the container, and Kubernetes is more the orchestration of those containers.
Cool. Operating systems, I suspect most people know what an operating system is, but essentially it sits in the background of any hardware you've got. So your mobile, so Apple have their own OS, Linux is an OS, Windows is an OS, and then you've got an Apple OS, Unix. So that's essentially what an operating system is. Testing, so we kind of went through it last week, but testing deployments is what happens to ensure that you don't get buggy code. And then a source code repository is looking at stuff like GitHub and Bitbucket. So essentially this can be, you can do open source or you can do a private repository depending on what you're trying to achieve. But essentially what it is a storage location for application code. So it means that multiple people can work collaboratively on a code base without having to firstly work off the same computer, but even the case with what's going to happen in the future where we look at remote teams and people working in completely different countries, that allows people to go to this code base and edit stuff before it goes out into the live code base, but from multiple locations.
Cool. Thanks, Darren. Cleared up a few of those questions there, I think. So I think where some of our audience get really excited is about the insight about how to recruit these guys as well. So maybe give us a quick summary on sort of salaries that we might be expecting to pay for some of these top candidates. Yes.
So DevOps, with it being such a broad spectrum of different skill sets, what I would say is that these salaries are on as a kind of median of what you would expect out in the market. So the more specialized you get, it works like in terms of like an equilibrium, so supply versus demand. And the more specialized you get, the more this can drive up. So we work with some clients that will pay upwards of 130 to 150K for a strong DevOps engineer. Whereas you get some companies that may say they are looking for a DevOps engineer, wherein they're really looking for someone to focus more on the infrastructure area of the skill set. So then you would look at, you probably wouldn't be paying anywhere near that kind of level. You probably would be paying somewhere between 65 and 70K. So these are median rather than this being an overarching salary data to look at.
And generally speaking, these guys are probably the most expensive people in all the roles we've covered so far, would you say? I think we see some salaries being offered for DevOps engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I would say that the three hot areas we see within our own platform is DevOps being one, React being the other, and then data science or data engineering that we'll move on to later in the week. They're probably the 3 or 4, if you separate data engineering and data science, areas that you're going to have to pay a lot to find the right people.
And just a couple of questions we've had, Daz, kind of touched on the same thing. So one's asked, do you see automation testers going for a DevOps role? Because obviously the automation testing part's, a key part of the process. And secondly, why don't you see many developers with DevOps experience, or those that want to go into DevOps? Which I'm not sure. I'd probably say that there are quite a few devs that do want to move into that world. But what's your take on that, Daz?
So I guess starting on the first question and moving on to the second. So do we see a lot of testers that move from test into DevOps? Not so much. I think that and feel free to jump in, Mark, but I feel like test is a completely different skill set. So a lot of it doesn't align to what you're looking at from a DevOps perspective. Yes, you might be able to develop scripts, but really you're going to need to be, for an SRE role, you're going to need to almost be a SDET level in terms of development in order to move into this area. And then you'd be looking at doing the ops side as well. So I think you'd be trying to merge too many skill sets. I think it's a completely different area. And then the second question, sorry, what was the second question again?
Why don't you see many developers that want to go into DevOps?
Yeah, I would tend to disagree with that. I think you see a lot of developers that want to move into DevOps because it is a very profitable area to move into. I think it's that companies don't tend to, a lot of time within DevOps market, we see that they want people to hit the ground running because they're so expensive. So people tend to have to come in with that skill set. We currently see in the market a lot of people that maybe don't know a lot of cloud platform stuff will be teaching themselves as well as teaching themselves in stuff like Kubernetes and Docker. So I think we'll see that shift more in the next 3 years. But I personally think a lot of developers would love to move to DevOps if it was possible.
Yeah, I think so. If I might just weigh in here. So I think some of the trends I've seen is that often that transition is something that people do within an organisation. So they'll be a developer already, and then get that training or exposure to DevOps tooling and skill set within a role. Moving, I think, as you say, between that software engineer to a new company for your first DevOps role is a bit less common.
Yep.
I've got a crowdsourced recruitment challenge here, Dad, so I can put you on your toes on if you fancy, Dale.
Go on.
So it is very common to see people throw the word DevOps on their CV when they are not a DevOps engineer. I guess a bit like Agile in that sense. What is the best way to decipher who's actually good for the role? I know you said to look at what they have done rather than the role. Is there a skill set which is considered ideal? So I'm going to give my 2 cents, Daz, and then if you want to jump in, and then we'll move on to the actual recruitment challenges we've put on the slide. But I think, yes, absolutely, it's a buzzword, so people are going to chuck on their CV for sure. Again, DevOps isn't a skill. Like, you can't be good in DevOps. It doesn't really make sense. There's DevOps culture, which means I've worked in a DevOps environment, which is all the stuff we've talked through today around continuous integration, continuous deployment, containerization. Or I might be good at some of the tools used within DevOps, but I would say, Daz, you can't be good at DevOps. Like, it's not something that you can be proficient in. But what is the best way to know if they're good for the role? I think the key thing is understanding what you are looking for in a DevOps engineer, because where you're at as an organization will depend on what you're looking at. So if you're right at the start of your journey, then you're probably focusing on someone that's really good on that continuous integration process. So that probably means you really want somebody that's got experience with Jenkins and the configuration management tools like Chef and Puppet and Ansible. If you're moving more towards that sort of DevOps nirvana and you want to get to continuous deployment, you might already have a lot of those skills internally, and your focus is to then go and find somebody that's really specialized in, I don't know, Kubernetes and Docker, I don't know, maybe some of that automation process that's around Terraform and infrastructure as code. So I think it really is really important to understand that hiring a DevOps engineer is a very broad term. And actually, it's really important you understand from your hiring manager, what part of this process are you looking for? because it's highly unlikely you're going to get someone that specializes in all of it end to end, and also your business will be at a certain point in time to need a certain skill. So and in terms of understanding their depth, again, just always ask those questions about how they've used it. And I think, Darren, you've touched on this last week. Have they used it themselves, or have they been part of an environment? So have they built Kubernetes clusters from scratch, or are they working with Kubernetes? That's two different, proficiencies there, two different levels of understanding. So I wouldn't say there is an ideal DevOps engineer. I wouldn't say there's an ideal skill for a DevOps engineer. I think it very much depends on where your business is at, to what skills you want to bring in at that specific time.
Yeah, that's fair. I think you covered that quite well.
Okay, so unless you've got points to cover there, and Darren, should we maybe just move on to those recruitment challenges, or do we have more Q&A?
No, let's move on to the challenges, given we've got 5 minutes.
Okay, so a little scenario here. So we're currently using GCP, which can you just remind everyone what GCP stands for in this context?
GCP is a cloud platform, Google Cloud Platform. The
Google Cloud Platform. But we're struggling to find suitable candidates in the market. What would you recommend? So what are the options for a recruiter in this situation?
Cool. So I think of cloud platforms very much in the same way that I think of front-end frameworks to much of an extent. So yes, it's something that you need to upskill yourself in to go from. So cloud platforms, you're looking at stuff like Azure, GCP, or AWS. But I think about them in very similar ways, where it would take you maybe 2 or 3 months to upskill yourself in a new cloud platform. But in terms of the fundamentals of them, they all relate in a lot of ways. So my recommendation would be to challenge your hiring managers on would they be open to other cloud platforms. GCP in particular is probably third in the market at the moment for the where you'll see most prevalently. So AWS being by far and away the most prevalent. So I think they had 60 to 65% of the market last time I saw. And then Microsoft or the Azure stuff is kind of 30%, and then GCP is like 10 to 15%. So if you are simply looking at GCP, you're looking at a very small segment of the market. So my recommendation would be to challenge your hiring managers and say, would you be open to other cloud platforms? And if you wouldn't, why? Like, what in particular does a candidate need to have that they wouldn't have if they don't know GCP? Would be my take on that question.
Cool. Any additional thoughts on that, Mark?
No, I think I absolutely agree. And again, always, to Phil's point last week, on when you're hiring for niche skills, if you do need that one expert in first, and that might be the route you need to go down, but just be aware that finding a GCP expert is going to take time, and that's where you might turn to a contractor. Even within or without IR35, we can park that for another year. But when you've got those niche skills, if you are really insisting, you might need to turn to contract resource, but you're probably going to be better off hiring for that aptitude and willingness to learn with somebody that's already got great cloud experience, as that said.
Cool. Okay. So second one we've got here. So looking at salary data that the job provided last week, it looks like we're paying below market rate. Apart from paying more, what can we suggest as alternatives there? Yeah,
nice. And I think this came up in the chat as well, right? About someone saying, why are they so expensive?
Yeah, exactly. So I think a lot of this comes down to that, yes, engineers are looking to be paid market rate, but engineers also, they're a weird bunch where they are as interested in the technology or what they're going to learn as they are the salary. Like, at the end of the day, they don't want to be taking the mick out or from a salary perspective. But if you're working on some amazing projects, or you can offer something outside of salary, so you can take them from utilizing from a sysadmin role into a DevOps role, and you can upskill someone, that's where you're going to get a lot of people interested. So the more you can offer them in terms of technology and the tools they can be using, and also the projects they can be working on, the better. I think where a lot of companies struggle is that all they talk about is, this is what you're going to be doing, this is how you'll be doing it, rather than talking to engineers about, this is what we can offer you. So you need to make sure that your salaries are somewhat aligned. Don't be 20K off what the market can offer. But if you're 5 or 10K off, but you can talk about something that will take that candidate to the next level in the next year, you will win a lot of the time. That would be my take.
Interesting. Okay, so in the minute or so we've got remaining, Mark, anything to add on that, or have we got one final question?
Nothing from the audience. So no, I think the only just again with echo, I think as I said there, right? I think what you've got to remember is technical people are still human. So money does matter. There was, I don't think so more, but there was this myth that money just didn't matter to these people, and if they could work on cool tech, then they'll forego 20 grand. I think, as Dad said, you need to be in the ballpark, and it's going to severely hamstrung your recruitment operations if you can't. But there's three main things, right? We always see that, which is work on interesting projects, work with interesting technologies, work with interesting people. So if you've got two of those three and you're 5 or 10 grand behind the market, then really about setting that throughout the recruitment process.
Exactly.
Great. So I think that's a great sentiment to wrap up today's session. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you hopefully tomorrow for our deep dive into some of these topics and go from there. Okay.
Amazing.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. See you tomorrow.